Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you are very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And I am aware that it's possible you may be hearing the whirring of a fan in the background. That's because my country is experiencing one of the, I'm assuming, 6 days of summer that we're going to get this year, and I'm just a bit too hot to be filming under lights without the support of a fan. I don't want to melt off my seat in front of you. So we are going to make do and keep our fingers crossed that it won't be too distracting. So with all that being said, let's hop in. In my video on the treason laws from a few weeks ago, which I will be leaving linked, I made reference to 2 rebellions that occurred during the reign of King Edward VI. In that video, I said I would be happy to make a video on those rebellions if any of you were interested. Many of you did in fact take to the comment section to tell me that you were indeed interested. And so, just like that, we have our topic for today. Let's take a look at the most turbulent year in the reign of King Edward VI. At the start of 1549, which was the second year of King Edward VI's reign, the boy king himself was 11 years old. Over the coming months, discord and disorder would affect not only his nation as a whole, it would also strike at the very core of his royal household. Indeed, as it would turn out, 1549 would be a year of profound loss for some of the king's closest family members. And although the rebellions that are mentioned in this video's title are indeed the focus of this video, I do think it's important that we touch on other significant events that are relevant that happened in 1549, as I believe they do provide vital additional context for us. Take, for example, the 17th of January, 1549. On this date, the king's uncle, Thomas Seymour, was arrested on suspicion of treason. I will leave my video on Thomas linked, as it does discuss the various charges or suspicions that were levelled against him. The king's half-sister Elizabeth, whom Thomas had sought to marry, fell under suspicion too. Indeed, members of her household were also arrested and interrogated at this time. On the 5th of March 1549, a parliamentary act of attainder against Thomas Seymour was passed. He was thus determined to be a traitor. Thomas was beheaded on Tower Hill on the 20th of March 1549. The King's diary from this time notes simply, quote, "Also the Lord Sudeley, Admiral of England," this refers to Thomas Seymour, "was condemned to death and died in March ensuing." Granted, we get little insight from this in regards to Edward's own beliefs, his own feelings about his uncle's conviction, and for that matter, his uncle's execution. Did Edward believe that his uncle had in fact been plotting against him, perhaps even in concert with Edward's own half-sister, or did he not? In either case, whatever he came to believe, I do have to wonder how that might affect an 11-year-old boy. Soon, though, King Edward's subjects would be the ones to become rebellious. At the root of the early disorder was religion. Specifically, the state-mandated alterations to the practice of faith, because the path of Reformation had been kicked up a notch from the very beginning of Edward's reign. This occurred through the injunctions of 1547. These required a move towards a faith practice that was more recognisably Protestant in character. Iconoclasm was to be the order of the day, as Edward's representatives sought, as they would have described it, to root out all idolatry and superstition in the English church. This was certainly not popular everywhere. Indeed, there was violent resistance to the stripping of images from parish churches in Cornwall in the April of 1548. So much so that a royal commissioner who was tasked with this work was killed. Then, at the start of 1549, on the 21st of January, Edward's Parliament passed the Act of Uniformity. This enshrined liturgical conformity into English law, and it enforced the use of a Book of Common Prayer. This Book of Common Prayer would be published just a few months later. The first Book of Common Prayer was drafted by committee. That committee was headed up by Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. In it was set down the complete forms of service for morning and evening prayers, the Litany, and Holy Communion. It also laid out the orders for baptisms, marriages, and funerals, all of which were now to be delivered in English rather than in the customary Latin. Additionally, as this liturgy was legally required to be used throughout England, that meant that local customs, familiar traditions, were now overwritten, all in the name of national cohesion. The so-called Prayer Book, or Western Rebellion, was fomented in response to these changes in the southwest of England. Those involved in this uprising demanded the return of a more conservative form of worship. They wanted, among other things, for their masses to be in Latin, for the dissolved abbeys to be rebuilt and restored, and for the return of the Act of 6 Articles of 1539. That act had been repealed in the very first year of King Edward's reign. However, Professor Mark Stoyle has argued that there may have been another aim of these rebels, that in fact they may have been seeking the deposition of Edward, that they wished to remove him from his throne in favour of his Roman Catholic half-sister Mary. Whatever their aims may have been, by the July, this rebel force is reported to have been many thousand strong. They besieged the city of Exeter, which was a key position for them to attempt to gain control of in Devon. They besieged Exeter for around 6 weeks. Now, this city was not expecting to be besieged. It had had limited warning of the siege, and thus preparations would have been less than ideal. An unprepared city under siege is a city in which the citizens risk being starved before relief forces could reach them and thus lift the siege. Waves of reinforcements would be dispatched by the government, including foreign mercenary troops. The use of foreign troops on English soil was a controversial action for the English government to take against its own people. In the battles that followed, government forces slowly but surely gained the upper hand at Fenny Bridges, Woodbury Common, Clyst St Mary, and Clyst Heath. The eventual relief of Exeter came on the 6th of August, 1549. The final battle of this uprising would occur 11 days later, on the 17th of August at Stamford Courtney. Here, the forces of the Crown won the day. Many of the surviving rebels fled, but those who were caught would be dealt with, and by that I do mean executed under summary justice. When the ringleaders were caught, they were soon transferred to the Tower of London for questioning. They would, unsurprisingly, be found guilty of treason and would eventually be executed. It has been estimated that more than 4,000 people were killed as they took part in this uprising. This represents a large percentage of the population of this region at that time. Although the Crown's forces did regain control, it had taken them weeks to do so. And during that time, the stability of the nation, arguably the very future of Edward's reign, had fallen into question. As Professor Stoyle points out, quote, "My research shows the rebels were far more organised than the standard accounts suggest, and had they attacked the royal forces sent to suppress them just a few days earlier, I suspect they would have triumphed, and the Protestant Reformation in England could well have been overturned." Of course, we can't know how much of an effect this would have had on individuals who believed, or at least claimed they believed, that their place, their success, was something that was God-given. But equally, I think this is a good time for us to remind ourselves of the importance of not reading history backwards. I mean, sure, we all know that there isn't going to be a successful challenge to the Tudors' place on the throne, but they didn't until it happened, until they won. So, as moments of crisis appear, as rebellions break out, each monarch, their councillors and their people, all one after another, have to live through the chaos and the uncertainty. Just as we have to do with the things that make our news cycles feel like a white-knuckle ride today. Unfortunately for Edward and his government, the chaos of the Prayer Book or Western Rebellion was only going to be compounded. Because changes to the religious character of England were not the only source of discontentment for his subjects. The growth in the practice of enclosure, whereby land that had once been used by an entire community as common ground for the grazing of livestock was being fenced off by landowners for their private use. Now, there was legislation to restrict this practice, but it was rarely being enforced. In July 1549, while the Prayer Book Rebellion was underway in the southwest, an uprising started in Norfolk in the east of England. This uprising is known today as Kett's Rebellion, after its leader, or rather one of its leaders, Robert Kett, who, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, was himself a landowner who had previously been prosecuted for enclosing lands. At first, this uprising focused its efforts on pulling down the fences and hedges that were enclosing the land, but before long, a force of thousands, in fact, contemporary estimates were that there were between 16,000 and 20,000 people involved, all of whom were soon encamped outside of Norwich. Indeed, before long, they would even take control of Norwich. They compiled a list of their grievances, things they wished to see remedied, and they sent this list to the king and his council. If you would like to read their list of demands, then I will be leaving a link to an open access text that contains that list in my description box. A pardon was offered in response to receiving this list. That offer of the pardon was refused. An army was therefore sent to put down this uprising. At the end of July, that royal force that had been sent was defeated by the rebels. This is starting to get worrying, although it is, I think, somewhat understandable. After all, as we know, there is at this time a fair old strain on the military might of the nation, because there was the uprising happening in the southwest, the so-called Prayer Book or Western Rebellion. That was drawing forces that way. This was only compounded by an ongoing conflict that was happening at the Scottish border. This was due to the so-called rough wooing. I can make a video on that in the future if it would be of interest, so do let me know. However, it has also been suggested that as the king's uncle, the Duke of Somerset, was sympathetic to the grievances that had been raised during this uprising, this made him slow to act against this disorder. After all, Somerset had previously, and was continuing to, show himself to be more than willing to act against the enclosures. This, though, did make him unpopular with the gentry and the nobility, because on the one hand, it felt like he was capitulating to rebellious subjects, and on the other, they were the ones who were benefiting from the process of enclosure. Towards the end of August, John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, was sent with a larger army to put down the uprising. He promptly retook Norwich, before meeting the rebels in a final and decisive battle on the 27th of August at Dussindale. Around 2,000 rebels were killed. But among the survivors were Robert Kett and his brother William. They were captured and transferred to the Tower of London. They were found guilty of treason. They were sent to Norwich for their executions. On the 7th of December, 1549, Robert Kett was hanged from the walls of Norwich Castle. His brother William was hanged from the steeple of Windham Church. While the state was making ready to execute these men, and the ringleaders of the Western Rebellion, King Edward's government, his Regency Council, was undergoing a period of marked change. Indeed, for a long time, The rebels we have discussed today, those who ended up lodged at the Tower of London, would have found themselves imprisoned alongside the Duke of Somerset, because the king's uncle had been brought down. Barrett L. Beer states that, quote, "The end of Somerset's protectorate was the consequence of the disastrous and costly war with Scotland and France, opposition to his domestic reforms, growing factionalism among nobility and gentry opposed to his authoritarian leadership, and fear that his populist policies would lead to further disorder among the commons." The Duke of Somerset saw the writing on the wall in regards to the court coup that was coming his way at the start of October. At first, he ordered all subjects to arm themselves and come to Hampton Court Palace in order to defend their king. But he must have realised that this was not going to be sufficient to preserve him, and so he took his nephew to Windsor Castle, moving him from Pleasure Palace to more easily fortifiable castle. Ostensibly, he is doing this for the king's protection, but I think it is worth remembering that it wasn't really the king who was under threat here. Somerset was. King Edward wrote of feeling like a prisoner during this time. Perhaps more appropriately, he should have realised he was being used as his uncle's human shield, because, of course, anyone who comes to Somerset is going to have to attack a castle in which a king is residing, and that is treason. Through this, Somerset was edging his nation towards civil war. This danger was, however, mercifully short-lived, because Somerset would capitulate to his enemies on the 11th of October. He would be placed in the Tower of London on the 14th of October. Somerset's removal from his positions of power would be confirmed by an Act of Parliament on the 14th of January 1550. The man who rose to take control after him was that saviour of Norwich, John Dudley. So what do you think of the events of 1549? What do you think it would have been like to have lived through that year? Which group, or maybe groups, do you think that you might have been rooting for, or even have joined up with? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comment section underneath this video. I would also love it if you could pop an emoji/social glyph in the comments too, because the more engagement a video gets, the more YouTube thinks people like it, and then they share it out further. That then helps us to grow this community. As we've been talking about rebellion, let's do something battle-y this time. So whatever emoji fits that for you, pop that in the comments. You can also find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to all the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope that you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please share it with your friends. In fact, if you like the channel, do let some pals know about it. You can let me know that you like this particular video by hitting the thumbs up. Please make sure you're subscribed to the channel. In fact, if you think you're subscribed, now is the time to check. Make sure that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you against your will. And while you are there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please do hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down that will appear so that YouTube will allegedly tell you when I've next uploaded and also when I'm planning on going live. I hope you can have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.